Hello. So, let's talk about that ending. Okay. So, we'll talk about the big thing that happened later, but let's start with the two main sort of, I guess, character arcs that are present in this book, which reach their conclusion here, which are Navani and Kaladin. So Navani and Kaladin are very much the main characters of this book. If Dalinar was the main character of the previous book, then Navani and Kaladin are here. And I would say that both of them have very well executed character arcs in this book, which is not something I can say for most other characters. I actually think that this book has a major weakness compared to all of the other Stormlight books, which is that basically all parts of the plot that aren't at Urithiru feel unfinished, feel insufficiently fleshed out, don't get satisfying conclusions, in my opinion. So I don't really have much to say about Shallan or Adolin or Dalinar. Well, I do have something to say about Dalinar later on, but mostly I feel like the only characters who really got to shine in this book were the ones who were at Urithiru. So Kaladin, Navani, and to a lesser extent, Venli. But let's talk about these characters then. So Kaladin has sworn his fourth oath, which was exactly what I predicted it would be. It wasn't exactly a difficult oath to guess, considering all of Kaladin's internal conflicts for the past two books. And I really like the way this ends here. I really like the fact that we go back to Tien, who was sort of, I would say, forgotten a bit by the plot for a couple of books. I like that we go back to Tien. I like that Kaladin's moment of transformation happens in a high storm. I feel like that's very fitting for who Kaladin is as a person. I really, really like that the first thing that Kaladin, the Protector, does with his shard plate is send it to envelop and protect other people. That's extremely fitting, in my opinion. I really like that touch. I didn't know that living shard plate could do that, but apparently it can. And I really think that's cool. Unfortunately, it came at the cost of Teft's life, and also the life of Teft's Spren. Fendorana, I believe her name was. And I think this was handled well. I don't think that Teft's death felt cheap. It felt like it was tragic, but it was also sort of a fitting end for his character arc, I suppose. I like that it felt like there was character development for both him and Moash in his death, rather than just for Kaladin. This feels like one of those things that could have easily been a case of a character being sacrificed for another character's development. And it didn't feel that way. I feel like everyone involved... I was about to say everyone involved benefited from Teft's death. Obviously not as people. Both Kaladin and, obviously, Teft himself were significantly harmed by Teft's death. And arguably so was Moash. But narratively speaking, I feel like a lot was done with Teft's death. This was a character death that was milked for all it was worth. And I say that as a good thing. That hasn't necessarily always been the case with character deaths. I feel like, for example, Elhokar's death was weirdly not that big of a deal, even for his mother and his sister. But, like, I suppose Elhokar didn't have much of a relationship with much of a positive relationship with his family. Anyway, I've gotten off track here. So, Kaladin's arc here, fantastic, great. I love that Lirin, actually, I do have one nitpick with Kaladin's arc. So, Lirin and all of these other people paint the Shash glyph on their forehead in honor of Kaladin. The Shash glyph is kind of a symbol of Kaladin's resistance, of Kaladin's willingness to do anything to protect others, and of Kaladin's victimization at the hands of the Light Eyes. And as a result, it feels weird that the fourth oath is what allows Kaladin to heal his Shash glyph. I feel like rather than healing it, he should have maybe embraced it. I don't know, I'm not sure. I get that it's supposed to be like a symbolic thing of Kaladin moving past the darkness in his past, moving past the trauma of his enslavement and all that, but it kind of feels like he's also maybe moving past what drove him, which is his anger at the injustices that were inflicted upon him, and I feel like that's not something he should lose. I'm not sure. This could go either way. We'll see where... I'm curious to see where Kaladin's arc goes in Book 5. That'll tell me retroactively whether this was a good decision or not on Brandon's part. Anyway, that's enough about Kaladin. Let's talk about Navani. So, Navani here really shines in this book in general. She goes from a frankly obscure minor character in all the previous books to easily one of the main cast of the series in this book. And I feel like that was handled really well. I feel like her rise to a greater level of self-confidence, a greater level of intellectual ability, I guess, of scholarship, was handled really well. And I really like that it all happened due to Raboniel. I like the fact that we essentially had a villain, quote-unquote, we'll talk about that in a minute, who helped create one of a character who is now a major protagonist. I feel like that's an interesting choice that I haven't seen done quite like this before. That said, I am still confused about the Fabrial thing. The sibling keeps saying that Fabrials are morally indefensible, and Navani keeps saying that they're not, but we just aren't given an actual answer to that. Like, we don't know whether the Spren in a Fabrial suffers. We don't know whether this is torture of sentient beings or not. And that makes Navani's bonding of the sibling a bit weird, because it feels like the lesson we're supposed to take from this is that both sides have a point and we should compromise, and like, no, in this particular issue, one side has to just be right. Like, if the sibling is correct, then there's no compromise. Navani needs to immediately stop making Fabrials. And if Navani is correct, then the sibling doesn't have a leg to stand on with their arguments. Like, it's weird that particular discussion has not been resolved in this book. And that's actually something that I feel like this book kind of dropped a lot of threads. In particular, something I realized is that we have no idea what happened with Malata, Taravangian's Radiant. she's just not mentioned in this book at all, and she didn't really get like any sort of conclusion at the end of the last book. I don't know what happened there. Likewise, it feels like there's several threads going on with Relaine that kind of get forgotten over the course of this book. Rock just kind of leaves, and we never hear from him again. Obviously, all of this is stuff that will be handled in the next book, I'm sure. It just feels odd compared to some of the previous books, which all felt like they took more of an effort to wrap things up by the end. And this one just kind of didn't. It just kind of left a bunch of stuff hanging. Anyway, I'm getting distracted here. Navani. So Navani and Raboniel's relationship in this book is maybe my favorite part of the book. It's this fascinating situation where they never, ever, ever trust each other, and they're never on the same side. They remain enemies throughout, but they also have a great deal of respect for each other, and Raboniel is such a compelling villain. I talked in the previous video about this concern I had, which was this idea that Raboniel would be reduced to her motherhood as a motivation, and how happy I was in part 4 when it turned out that Raboniel was actually an evil monster, and not just a grieving mother. And then in this book, that too was kind of undermined, because it turns out Raboniel is all of these things. She is a monster, she is a mother, and she is also kind of a hero, because Raboniel's monstrous actions were done out of a sense of extremely utilitarian ethics. Raboniel wants the war to end. She believes that the war is a great evil, which is true, and while she would certainly prefer her side to win, she also would be fine with the other side winning if that's what it takes to actually end the war. So when it becomes clear that she can no longer guarantee the victory for her side that she was hoping for, she is willing to give an advantage to the enemy just for the sake of being able to end this war no matter what. And that's a really interesting position, essentially radical pacifism through unspeakable violence. Like, she's trying to end violence through violence, which I don't love. I mean, I'm not saying that I agree with her, but it does make for a very unique villain motivation, and I genuinely wonder whether it was a mistake to kill her in this book. A mistake on Brandon's part, I mean, not Navani's part. Because I feel like Raboniel could have grown into one of the most fascinating characters in the Stormlight Archive, and I'm kind of disappointed that I'll never get to see that now. But what we got in this book was incredible from her. Much more so than Lezian, who was a bad and boring villain, by the way. Like, Lezian just wasn't very interesting. But I do like... Okay, I need to stop getting distracted. So, I'll get back to Lezian in a moment. So, to finish the Navani thing and Raboniel, I really like how this story played out. I feel like there was something a bit cheesy in the end about Dalinar being like, I should never have doubted you, Navani. You proved me wrong. That felt a bit weird because, like, he hadn't doubted her. Like, that wasn't an issue in their relationship that had been established, in my opinion. It kind of felt like in Dawnshard, when we had the whole Lopen realizing he needs to stop hurting others with his pranks moment, where I was like, but he wasn't doing that. Like, we haven't established this as a problem. And that it felt kind of the same here, with Dalinar apologizing to Navani for not valuing her properly or whatever. Like, did you forget to write that part, Brandon? Anyway, so that's my one nitpick about the Navani plotline in this book. Otherwise, I think everything... Well, that and the fact that the Fabrial thing doesn't get resolved. Otherwise, I really liked it. Going back to Kaladin, though, I just remembered one thing I wanted to say. I really like the way Kaladin beats Lezian. I don't like Lezian as a character. I don't think he's very interesting, but I appreciate him in retrospect for allowing for this scene, because I really like the idea of a character who is obsessed with reputation and who essentially exists only as his reputation, being defeated by undermining that reputation. That's a nice bit of narrative symmetry. And it also, it both allows Kaladin to be clever and show that he is able to beat Lezian at his own game, and then, when Kaladin begins to fall to Odium's influence, it also allows Kaladin to demonstrate some truly horrific brutality. The way Cal kills Lezian here was horrifying. That's not a use of adhesion that had ever occurred to me before. That's horrific. What the hell? The ripping his head off like that. Jesus. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. Now, staying in Urithiru for a while, I'm purposefully delaying going to Dalinar and Yasna because that's where the juicy stuff is in a lot of ways. But staying in Urithiru for a while, Venli and R'lain, which is kind of a single topic here. So Venli comes clean to R'lain and he does not take it well. Like, he gets pissed when he learns the truth, which makes sense, because while I've talked about before how there's an interesting situation with Venli where I would argue that her actions are kind of a net positive, morally speaking, in terms of their outcome so far, I still feel like, from the perspective of literally any listener, what she did is monstrous, because she did essentially lead to the genocide of their people. Now, of course, some of them survived, and she meets them at the end, and that's all great. But from her perspective, and from R'lain's perspective, when she tells him this, she's a monster. And it makes sense that he would respond the way he did. What surprised me a bit was Leshwi's response to realizing that Venli is a Radiant. So Venli comes out as a Radiant to Leshwi, and we get an interesting response from Leshwi, which kind of seems to imply to me that at some point Leshwi was a Radiant? Maybe? Like Leshwi talks about, oh, there's this honor spren I knew, he was a close friend, do you know what happened to him? And that kind of sounds like maybe Leshwi had a bond with a spren at some point? Is that a thing? Were there Singer Radiants? Because I was under the impression that the Knights Radiant were created, like, well into the process of the Desolations happening. I wasn't aware of, like, no one has indicated that there were surge binders of any kind among the Singers before the humans' arrival, but this kind of makes it sound like there were? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe she meant just a regular friend and not a bonded spren, but it did sound like she meant something more. Anyway, this is enough to convince Leshwi to fully turn against Odium, fully turn against the other fused, and she, along with a few of the other heavenly ones, joins Venli in her exodus from both sides into the Shattered Plains. And I did not expect that to happen so soon. Like, it was very clear from early on in this book that Leshwi was being built up to essentially turn away from Odium, but I didn't expect it to happen this early. I expected that to be like a multiple book arc. But now that she has, it begs the question, what is this new faction going to do? Venli talks about how they should remain neutral. She talks about how they shouldn't side with either the Singers or the humans, and I think Leshwi largely agrees with that. But I am curious what the other listeners who survived are going to think. Because the listeners who survived, well, I don't know what they might. I feel like they would agree with Venli, but maybe not. They do appear to be preparing for war of some kind, based on the fact that they've tamed chasm fiends somehow. So, going forward, I'm really curious to see where this new faction that's arising in the Shattered Plains is going to end up going. They definitely won't serve Odium, but will they create an alliance of some sort with the humans and the Radiants, or will they fight against both sides? It's an interesting conundrum. I don't think the humans would attack them, but something Relaine said here might be an issue. Back to Relaine. Relaine talks about his concern at the end that whatever solution the humans come up with to the problem, to the war, might result in the Singers losing their minds again and becoming Parshmen. Now, based on what we know so far, like based on the situation with Dalinar and Odium and what's going on there, that doesn't appear to be something that Dalinar is really considering or really able to accomplish. But I feel like Relaine wouldn't have mentioned it here if that wasn't set up for the future. So I'm wondering if in the next book, Dalinar is going to start seriously considering a solution that would be morally indefensible in terms of the treatment of the Singers. And I'm also wondering if he does that, whether Navani might turn against him. Because I feel like Navani and the sibling might be specifically in this story to strongly advocate for peace based on what Navani did in this book. I feel like while Dalinar's bonds that he smiths as a bondsmith are between the different factions of humans and between humanity and the Spren and so forth, I feel like Navani's primary bondsmithing is going to be between the races, between humans and Singers. And maybe even, well, I was going to say between Honor and Odium, because she made the whole Rhythm of War thing and Warlight, but I don't think that's really plausible, especially with what happens with Odium at the end of this book, which I'm still not going to talk about. I'm gonna draw that out for as long as possible. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Anyway. Wow, I got completely distracted there. What was I talking about? Right. So, that's it for everything going on at Urithiru. Now, let's move on to Yasna and Dalinar. And I'm gonna start with Yasna, because she only gets, I think, like one chapter here, but that chapter is a doozy. So, remember when I said that there was like a weird relationship going on between Yasna and Wit, and how I wasn't sure if we're supposed to interpret that as them being a couple or not? Well, I'm sure now. Apparently, Hoyd is just dating Yasna Colon. Okay. on the list of characters who I expected to get a romantic subplot in the Cosmere, Hoid is probably at the bottom. But I guess this is happening. And it's very explicitly a romantic relationship. And it's even explicitly mentioned that they do have sex, which is also interesting because in the same breath it's also confirmed that Yasna is asexual, which I appreciate. It's always nice to get some representation for us aces. And I kind of have to wonder. Hoid is like, what, 10,000 years old? Is he really interested in romance or sex or relationships at this point? Like, at all? I mean, I guess he is, but I guess we're just supposed to take that at face value. I would have assumed that he wouldn't be. But, okay. I could make a joke here about the age difference, but Yasna's an adult. In fact, Yasna is more mature than Hoid, let's be honest. So that's not an issue in this particular relationship. The way I felt it was in some others that happened in various Cosmere books and talked about in, I believe, one of my Words of Radiance videos. So I'm not gonna bother with that. So we learned that Yasna is asexual, and we learned that she's dating Hoid, but we also learned that she doesn't fully trust him, which I think is interesting. Hoid and Yasna are working together, and they are together as a couple, but they do have different goals. Because Hoid's goal is still to prevent Odium from leaving the Rosharan system, whereas Yasna's goal is to actually protect the Rosharan system. And I feel like if there comes a point where it is possible to release Odium from the Rosharan system in a way that would save Roshar, but to doom the rest of the Cosmere, I feel like Yasna might do it. I talked earlier about how Yasna has some parallels with Teravangian, and how I can imagine her making the same choice Teravangian did, to sacrifice the world for a single city. And now I'm wondering if Yasna is going to be in a similar position but on a much larger scale. A position to sacrifice the universe for a single world. And whether she would be willing to take that particular path. And speaking of sacrificing things for other things and making dubious deals with Odium, Dalinar, my friend. Let's talk about Dalinar. So, Dalinar makes a fascinating deal with Odium here that I think is doomed. So I feel like the way this has been set up, I can predict a couple of things for sure for the next book. One, Dalinar will not get to actually be his own champion. He wants to, but something will happen that will prevent that. That seems like basically assured just because it's been built up so much. Two, if the contest goes forward, if something messed up doesn't happen to prevent it, Dalinar will lose. And the reason I say this is because, well, one, there's 5 more books after book 5, and so we can't beat Odium next book. And two, the specific last thing that Odium adds here, which is that Dalinar has to serve him forever as an agent beyond Roshar if he loses, feels like too interesting of an idea for it to not come to pass. I feel like that wouldn't even be introduced as an idea unless it was definitely going to happen. Which brings me to my insane, wild, out there prediction. So, Spoilers for Mistborn Era 2 incoming. 3, 2, 1. I believe that Trell is Dalinar. So I've been informed that Mistborn Era 2 actually takes place after Stormlight Part 1, so after Book 5 of the Stormlight Archive, and that immediately made me realize this. So I predict that what is going to happen next is that Dalinar will lose his contest with Odium, he will be made Odium's agent outside of Roshar, and the first place Odium is going to send him is Scadrial. And Dalinar will have the power of the Thrill with him, either through being given it by Odium himself or by saving Ner'ghaul from the bottom of the ocean. I'm not sure, but I think that what is happening on Scadrial is Dalinar colon, which is a bold claim that I have very little evidence for other than I think it would be cool. That's the only prediction I'm going to make, like the only really strong prediction I'm going to make right now, because you may notice I've neglected to talk about some very important elements of this part of the book. And the reason for that is that I'm going to end the video now, and I'm going to make a second video. But, same as usual, a second video where I discuss sort of plot stuff going forward. But in that second video, because I am now fully caught up with the Cosmere, before I make that second video, I am going to do two things. One, I am going to read the prologue to Stormlight Book 5, which has been released. And two, I am going to go online, go on the wiki, and read up on various fan theories, interpretations, various things that Brandon has confirmed outside of the books at book signings and events and stuff, and AMAs. I am going to try my best to bring my knowledge of the Cosmere up to snuff with where most of the people watching this are, which is to say, full knowledge of everything that the fandom currently knows. And I'm going to talk about my predictions for the future with that in mind. And again, and that's where I'm also going to talk about the implications I think are going to come from the Teravangian thing. You know, the thing that just happened. Which has huge implications going forward. Yeah, I'm going to do that. You may notice that I had less to say about character arcs in this part. I don't know whether it's an issue with my video format or if the books themselves are becoming a bit less character-focused. But I find myself having less and less to say about the characters, which I'm kind of disappointed by. I feel like that was a highlight of the books early on, and now I feel like the characters, other than standouts like Navani and Kaladin in this book, I feel like most of the characters are kind of just like they've reached their final forms, if that makes sense. Like there isn't that much development left to go. Shallan had a big one in this book, but I felt it was very rushed and poorly handled. I sound very critical. I want to clarify. I love this book. I think this was a great book, but I do think it was probably the weakest of the 4 Stormlight books I've read. I would say that while this book has some great moments, it fails to be thematically cohesive and have the strong character arcs that I've come to expect from previous Stormlight books. And I feel like that's maybe a symptom of sort of like a middle book syndrome, kind of. even though this isn't obviously the middle book of the first part of Stormlight, I feel like this book had a lot to do narratively in order to set up book 5. And I think that kind of led to this book sacrificing some of its own identity that it could have otherwise had, especially here in part 5. The final parts of a Sanderson book are known for being these incredibly dramatic climaxes where everything is going on at once, and this part 5 was that, but didn't feel like it, because everything was a bit disjointed. The climaxes of Dalinar's and Teravangian's side of the story were completely unconnected to the climaxes going on at Urithiru, which were themselves completely disconnected from the climax going on in Shadesmar. And that's something that kind of leaves this book in an odd position. I think that once book 5 comes out and once I read that, I'm hoping that I will retroactively appreciate this book more, but it does feel like a weird place to end my Cosmere journey for now, just because of how inconclusive a lot of it is compared to previous books. I hope that makes sense. So, I'm going to go and read the prologue and read all that other stuff that I said I was going to read. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about the major implications for the plot of what happened here with Teravangian. And I'm also going to talk about my predictions for the future of the Stormlight Archive and the Cosmere as a whole. Other than the prediction which I already gave, which is that Trell is Dalinar. We'll see if anything I learn in the prologue of 5 changes that, or on the wiki or whatever, but I doubt it. Anyway, goodbye. I'm going to go do all of that now, and I will be back for not the final Cosmere video I'm going to make, but certainly the final video I'm going to make that's like tied to a book I've just read. So, until the next book comes out, of course. So, see you